Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be talking about Eastern versus Western thinking in biblical interpretation. Western thinking, and I'm a citizen of the United States of America, and so I'm thoroughly Western in my thinking as opposed to Eastern thinking. In the West, we're a very individual culture. Our commercials reflect that. I think of even in the military. I grew up in a military family, and one of the advertisements of the military, I don't know if they're still using it these days, but they used to say, "Be all that you can be, an army of one." Appealing to the individualness, and yet think about this: the military is probably one of the most group things that you have in any society. And yet there's an appeal to Western thinking, whereas in the East there's more of an emphasis on collectivism, families, and unity, and we do it together and we think it together. In the West, they tend to be much more time-oriented. I'm a professor, so I start my classes on time, watch the clock, and when the hour strikes, we pray and we begin the class. In the East, they are much more timeliness oriented. Where's the right season? And you can say that a class is going to start at 3 o'clock, and that means everybody gets there perhaps sometime that afternoon. In the West, we're all about rules. And we have a rule for this and a rule for that, and if there's exceptions, they have to be listed out in a very contractual way. In the East, it's much more about relationship as opposed to rules. I'm not saying they don't have rules, but the emphasis is more upon relationship. In the West, we have great value in right and wrong, and those are the categories to which we tend to gravitate. In the East, they still have the quality of right and wrong, but the emphasis more is upon honor versus shame. Think about this when you have, for example, the story that takes place in Genesis chapter 3 of Adam and Eve in the garden and the serpent. And I always ask my students, what took place there? And very oftentimes they say, well, they fell into sin. And yet the word sin is not mentioned there in Genesis chapter 3. I'm not saying that they did not fall into sin. Certainly that took place, but it's not mentioned in the chapter. Instead, we read about how they ate and their eyes were open and they were ashamed. The story itself is told in terms of honor and shame. Now, these categories, honor and shame, as I said, we have these in the West, but they are not as strong. And so, in the East, strength, that's an honorable thing, as opposed to being weak. That would be considered shameful. The right hand, and incidentally, even today, if you go to an Eastern culture, and your guides will tell you, don't shake hands with somebody using your left hand, because the right hand, that's the hand of honor. That's the hand where you reach in and eat the food together. The left hand was used for other things. Remember, back in the ancient world, they didn't have toilet paper, and so you get the idea there. A blessing is something that's honorable as opposed to a cursing. Being free was an honorable state as opposed to being a slave. Having a kingdom and a king and being fruitful, those were things that had honor connotations. They were honorable as opposed to being naked. Remember how Jesus was crucified and they stripped his clothes from him. It was considered, yes, painful, but it was also considered shameful. Hebrews chapter 12 actually speaks of that, how he went to the cross despising the shame. And so the idea of being crucified, that was something shameful you did to somebody. Yes, it was incredibly painful, but it was also incredibly shameful. It was a humiliation, and humility, being humbled, it was considered a shameful thing. Home is a place of honor. A barren woman was considered shameful to being such a woman. Holiness was an honorable thing. That which was defiled or unclean, those things were considered shameful. Having power and being pleased with somebody, the heir of the house, the one who would receive the inheritance, that was honorable. Being sick was considered something that was shameful. Being childless, being impure, each of these were shameful places to be. Being a father was expected to have honor in his house. The book of Malachi actually asks the question where God says, if I'm your father, where's my honor? And of course, a son was an honorable thing. A daughter, not quite so much. Being a Gentile among the Jews was considered dishonorable. And you have to read the scriptures with these categories in mind to get the full grasp of the message that's being given. And so back to our categories between Eastern versus Western thinking. In the West, we have a tendency to express truth in propositional terms. In the East, the tendency is to express truth in concrete terms. And the way I like to illustrate this, and if you haven't gotten my point, the Bible, both Old and New Testament, is written largely to those who were more oriented toward Eastern thinking than Western thinking. Now, again, there's a range there, but the orientation of the Bible tends to be more toward those that have that Eastern mindset, which means that truth is expressed very oftentimes in concrete terms. And the way I like to illustrate this is with the question, what is God? And I ask this of my theology students, and they'll say, well, God is a spirit. He's infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. And that's all correct. But what I've done is describe God in propositional terms instead of concrete terms. Now, I can get all of those categories from the Bible, but the Bible doesn't specifically use those terms. Instead, to answer the question, what is God? Psalm 18, verse 2, for example. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. Those are things that you can see. You can see this big rock, this big, giant, massive, rocky escarpment. And that pictures God in how he's immovable, one in whom you can take refuge. It presents a vivid picture, and that's how truth is expressed. Or take Psalm chapter 121, verses 5 and 6, a wonderful passage where we read that the Lord is your keeper, the Lord is your shade on your right hand. That's desert language, by the way. When you're out in the desert, even a little shade will do. You know, you'll look for anything, a boulder or even a bush. Verse 6, the sun will not smite you by day, nor the moon by night. Very vivid imagery, concrete imagery, to describe the truth that's being presented. Or a favorite of all of ours, Psalm 23 and verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And the image then takes you, beginning with that, God as shepherd. They knew what a shepherd looked like. They could visualize that. They could see that. And God is described in those very concrete terms. You get to verse 2 of Psalm 23. He leads me beside quiet waters. And of course, you have to see this, not by the ocean or in a lush area, but shepherds would take their sheep out into the wilderness. And in the wilderness, that can be a dangerous place. You see, you're looking at this nice picture of the sheep, and there's quiet waters. But you have to ask the question, how did that water get there? It doesn't rain there in the wilderness. The rain comes from somewhere else, perhaps miles away, and might come flooding through the area. And one who comes from the desert knows this. And so it again communicates through the picture. So we looked at the West with expressing truth in propositional terms versus the East expressing truth in concrete terms. In Western thinking, they express truth in absolute categories. This is true, and if there's exceptions, we'll list them accordingly. In Eastern thinking and in Eastern communication, the tendency is to express truth in generalities. And we see this not just in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well. For example, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12 has been the topic of lots of debate in churches today, where Paul says, I do not allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. And it's expressed there in what look like to be very concrete terms. And you say, well, wait a minute, Paul, what about over in 1 Corinthians chapter 11? You talked about women praying and prophesying, and you just said you don't allow them to, to teach or exercise authority. Isn't there some authority in prophesying? What about that? And Paul would probably answer. He says, "Well, yes, generally that's true, but here's an exception to the rule." Or you might say, "Well, Paul, what about in the Old Testament where you had not just the kings and the judges, but I remember a judge by the name of Deborah, or the prophetess Huldah, who exercised. She went in and told the king what to do, and he did it." And again, Paul would say, "Well, that's true. I don't allow a woman to teach her exercise authority over a man normally, but there are these exceptions, and the exceptions are not necessarily stated in Eastern thinking." Another place you see this is in Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, where Jesus says to those that are listening, he says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery." And there's no further explanation of that. It's just set forth. But when we read the parallel passage in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, Jesus gives the exception there of the innocent party, except in cases of adultery, and the idea there is when one party was sinned against, then they're not under that bondage. Mark doesn't give the exception. Did he not believe it? No, because in Eastern thinking you can speak in generalities, and it's understood there might be exceptions to the general rule. Now, next I want to talk about I'm going to change tacks a little bit. And this quality, I'm going to use this Yiddish phrase, chutzpah. A variation of it is used a couple of times in the book of Daniel, but not quite in the context that we're going to talk about it. And the term refers to the quality of audacity, audacious action. And we see this quality several times, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, I was brought up in very polite society, so this audacity is something that sort of, it grates a little bit against my personality. But that's because I was brought up in a Western culture rather than an Eastern culture. So for example, this quality is seen in Abraham. And you remember the story where God shows up and he's revealing to Abraham his plans, how he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham begins bargaining with God. Well, how about if there's 50? Or, well, what about if there's 40 or 30 or 20 or 10? And there's this bargaining that's going back. He's speaking to God. How can that take place? And it's because there's this audacity that Abraham feels, even though he respects God. It's not dishonoring against God, but he audaciously asks God in faith for that which he wants. Or take the example of Jacob wrestling with an angel. And perhaps not at first, but eventually he gets the idea this is no ordinary individual with whom he is struggling. He is struggling with that which represents or is in somehow, some way, shape, or form, God. And he says, bless me, I won't give up, I won't let go, I want the blessing. It's a bit audacious. It's this quality of chutzpah. And what happens at the end of the story? Well, he is blessed. And God honors his audacious, can I say it this way? His audacious faith. Because really, it's a question of faith. Now, we see that when we come to the New Testament as well. In the New Testament, Matthew chapter 15, beginning in verse 22, we read, "And behold, a Canaanite woman came out from that region and began to cry out, saying, 'Have mercy upon me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed.'" And Jesus did not answer her a word. She's requesting him, and he doesn't answer her. He sounds like he's ignoring her. I don't know exactly what that looked like. But his disciples are there, and his disciples came to him and kept asking him, "Can you just send her away? She's bothering us. She's shouting out after us." And notice there's a continuation of action that's taking place. And enough is enough. Verse 24, but he answered and said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. She's not Israelite, she's Canaanite. She's a foreigner. But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, Lord, help me. And he answered and said, and again, this is rather harsh on his part, it sounds like, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, I don't care how you translate it, and I have to recognize, by the way, when he uses the word for dogs, it's he softens that a little bit, just a touch, by using the diminutive form. But still, that's harsh. It's harsh language. And she pushes back, and this is her chutzpah, her arrogant request, her request in faith. But she said, yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table. She won't give up. Then Jesus answered and said to her, O woman, your faith is great. Be it done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed at once. Jesus pushes her for that non-relenting, that pushy request to continue, because that's the kind of faith that he wishes. Now, one more example, and this is Jesus himself, where Jesus is before Pilate, and Pilate's saying, why aren't you're not acting appropriately. You're not acting like a condemned criminal. You're acting a bit different. And Jesus answered, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. Can I posit that Jesus answers with just a bit of chutzpah, this quality where he pushes back at Pilate? And this is what I would suggest perhaps is the chutzpah of the cross. That the cross itself was an example of Jesus taking that which was considered shameful, the nakedness, the pain, the crucifixion, and turning it into a victory. And he is our victor, and he has won the victory for us through his death, burial, and of course, in the end, his resurrection. Because he did not stay dead, he rose for us so that we can have, can I suggest it? That we can have a faith that pushes back against unbelief. A faith that has just a bit of that quality of chutzpah.